Tai Slewallian is in St John's, one of the few government departments with its headquarters well outside of Douglas, and it's the home of the Department of the Environment, Food and Agriculture. The building's design is unusual, and it was to maximise natural ventilation and daylight, and it's aided by a central atrium and overhanging eaves to reduce the heating. It's a building with the use of extensive timber, as timber was considered to be one of the most sustainable building materials available, and its heating is the first government site to be heated by wood chip. Well, compared with some other government departments, we don't hear as much about DEFA, but in the past few months the media spotlight, both at home and abroad, has focused on some of its activities, including the fisheries row with Scotland, the future of the ailing meat plant, plastic pollution, international conferences, the UNESCO Biosphere Award, and the implications of Brexit. Well, in today's programme we shall explore some of the range of its past, present and future duties and responsibilities of the department with our studio guest. We welcome the Minister for Environment, Food and Agriculture, Glenfaber and Peel MHK, Geoffrey Boot. Well, Geoffrey, I'm saying there that the department has a wide range of functions, but when I started to look up some of them before we came in here today, I rediscovered even functions I didn't know you had. Quite a big, extensive range of duties, haven't you, really?
Yes, good morning, Roger, and listeners. Yes, DEFA sounds very simple, environment, food and agriculture, but we have a large footprint on the island, and we cover a lot of ground. Department of Infrastructure does different things and also has a large footprint, but if you look at the department in the whole, environment, that's fairly straightforward, but it also includes environmental health and safety, planning, building regulations, road traffic licensing, office of fair trading, and if you look further down at what we do with the fisheries and the agricultural side, agriculture is obviously, it affects all of us on the island with the biosphere status. We look at waste management, we have the government lab under our control. We control the sawmill, the wildlife park, animal health. There's a lot going on there, Roger.
Well, all of these things, your words, not mine, are to protect and enhance the essentials of life.
Well, you could put it like that, and I hope we do that. Certainly in the food sector, we do our bit in the fisheries in terms of ensuring that we get good quality food, sustainable agriculture and fisheries. So on the other side of it, health and safety and environmental health, very important to all our lives. It goes on behind the scenes. People don't quite understand sometimes just how important that is to us as a community and a nation, that we have proper rules in place.
Yes, foodborne and infectious diseases caught my attention. These are infectious diseases that come in on all sorts of imported food, or in with the trees or the bees, or what is it?
Well, hopefully we don't have any importation of infectious diseases, but there are some things that happen. We look after animal health as well as public health. When it comes to animal health, we ensure that any animals brought to the island are healthy. We have a very high health status on our animal herd, beef, cattle here, and we want to retain that. It's not always possible to monitor everything. We've had Phytophthora spread over from the UK, and we couldn't stop that. We've now got ash dieback. That's another disease that's windborne, and we couldn't stop that. But when it comes to things like foot and mouth outbreaks, then there are things that we can do to prevent it happening.
Yeah, we're very successful twice, I think, before with that, and that's with the time when the TT was abandoned because of it.
We have indeed, and been very lucky in that respect, and let's hope there is not another outbreak in the UK in the near future.
Well, the department used to be known as the Board of Ag and Fish. So agriculture is one thing, but fishing is another. What does the Fisheries Directorate do?
Well, it has quite a wide remit. We have a territorial sea out to 12 miles. The 0 to 3 we control. The 3 to 12 all comes within a fisheries management agreement, which is basically an agreement with our surrounding jurisdictions and administered, as it were, via DEFRA in the UK. And that allows us to control our territorial sea, but guarantees, I use that word loosely, but certainly grants historic rights of access from the surrounding jurisdictions in the Irish Sea. You may have heard that the UK has served notice on the London Convention, which allows access from further afield than jurisdictions just around the Irish Sea. When that falls, and if and when Brexit takes place, the FMA will be up for renegotiation, and like most of the surrounding jurisdictions, we would like more control in terms of access.
So let us sit quite clear before we discuss what happened with the Scottish fishermen recently. But what you're saying is we own the territory, but from 3 to 12 miles, we don't have an exclusive right on it.
It's subject to an agreement, the Fisheries Management Agreement, which is administered via DEFRA. We're signatories to that, and that basically controls the measures we're allowed to put in place, such as licensing and the science and catch limits, etc. But we are subject, and bear in mind that scallops we're going to talk about in a minute, I'm sure, are not subject to quota. We are subject to quota, European Union quota, and we have very little quota for other fish in our own territorial sea, and that sometimes a bit of a bone of contention. For instance, herring, Manx kippers. Wouldn't it be nice if we were using Manx caught herring to make our kippers?
Yes, well, indeed, because they're they're bigger, those that have been brought in, aren't they? A different type of herring. But the Manx territorial seas, I think most of us thought that in 1991 we purchased all the rights of the 12-mile limit for £800,000.
Well, I wasn't around in 1991. I just know what is happening now in terms of the FMA and the powers that we have within the FMA, and the fact that in due course we will have to renegotiate that.
Well, yes, it does stand, though, still looking at it, of course. There's all the rights for oil exploration, gas exploration, licenses for pipelines to run through the territory. We seem to collect all of that. We just seem to miss out on the fish.
We do indeed, and but fisheries is a different kettle of fish. The seabed is static, and the resource below the seabed is static, whereas fisheries tend to be more fluid. We have access to other waters around, and at the moment we don't. Our fishing fleet doesn't access those waters to any degree, simply because the main catch is scallops, queen scallops and king scallops. Now, one of the fears is if we lose that historic right of access and the quota system changes, our fishermen may decide to diversify and not be able to access other waters. At the moment it seems the balance is against us in terms of vessels accessing our waters, but we also have to be aware of the future, and of course stocks are mobile. Scallops don't observe territorial boundaries, and respawning, etc., takes place outside of our waters, so we need to cooperate with other jurisdictions to make sure that we don't decimate stocks in the Irish Sea.
How big is the Manx fishing fleet in general now? Is there a certain number of boats registered?
It's certainly much reduced. For instance, in the king scallop fishery, of the 89 boats licensed to fish, 31 are Manx, and our fleet has adapted. Crabs, lobsters, whelks have become another fishery that is being exploited, and recently we brought in licensing and pot restrictions there so that we don't allow it to go beyond unsustainability. So we're looking very carefully. In fact, I think it's fair to say that we probably have some of the best science around the UK in terms of what we have in our sea and monitoring the same. And when it comes to scallops particularly, we have a scallop board now. We used to have a queen scallop board, but I amalgamated that, and it's now a joint scallop board. It's non-partisan. It has participants from all the other jurisdictions, and the Northern Ireland chairman, who's very well known and respected, and they give our department advice, having looked at the evidence that comes from Bangor University, who we commission to do much of our research.
Well, this is fine, but it still makes you wonder, doesn't it? It's just exactly whether we're being sold down the river. Fishing used to be a traditional industry, and now you say it's hardly there at all.
Well, if you look at what's happened over the last 30, 40 years with the European Union and quota, and also a reduction in stocks generally, some of the measures have been good, some have been bad, but I was not here when initial quota was carved up, so I can't comment on how that happened and how the negotiations
but you're there now, you're in the job now, of course, and you've got to deal with it.
And that's why I'm very keen in the future, when and if Brexit happens and the London Convention falls, that we get the best possible deal for our fishermen and our economy.
Right. So what powers do you have? I mean, this hoo-ha cropped up because you decided that the Scottish fishermen should come in and report their catch to Douglas before they went to their home port. And that caused a kerfuffle, which seems to me, after a lot of noise from the Scottish Parliament, that you had to roll over and have your tummy tickled. It seems you gave in.
And there is a view that happened, but in fact it's far from the truth. It wasn't just reports, incidentally, to Douglas, it was any one of our ports. We have for a number of years now ensured that Queen Scallop fishing boats reported to a Manx port before they returned to their own port so that we could monitor their catches. It was felt and it was discussed at the Scallop Board that we should, bearing in mind intelligence, that there was good evidence that people were not sticking by the rules with the reduced catch limits and the total catch. And if we don't do that, it just throws all our conservation measures out of the door, because we have to know what's being caught. You only have to look at how the Queen Scallop population stocks crashed after 2011 and how carefully we've had to control that since. Last year we had a real race to fish in the king scallop fishery, and I introduced a limit very quickly, fortunately, but even that has not stopped a marked reduction. But yes, there was an element of resentment, kickback from fishermen who, to a certain extent, were right. We were penalising everyone and adding additional cost for those that were engaging in miscreant behaviour. So it was flagged up, and as these things do, we negotiated, and I'm very pleased to say that the Scottish fishery and the other surrounding fisheries acknowledge that there is a problem. We all see that there is a problem and that needs addressing. So after some negotiation, it was decided that we would lift the requirement to return to a Manx port before going to the port to land, and introduce a measure where, after examining our legislation, the AG's office informed us that we can suspend licences on reasonable suspicion.
So these boats who are fishing in Manx waters have a separate licence so to do?
They have a Manx licence.
They're not a UK licence, it's a Manx one.
They will probably have a UK or Scottish licence as well, but to fish in our waters they need a separate Manx licence.
Well, how then do you police it? I mean, first of all, you must have had some suspicions to do it in the first place.
We have indeed, and we've had fairly good intelligence on that, and that's acknowledged by the surrounding
jurisdictions. How do you know now
jurisdictions.
whether they're doing it or not?
Well, let's go back to the original concept. Vessels fishing in our waters were required to return to one of our ports, or to call at one of our ports, to have their catch checked. Now, we gave a little bit on that, and we said that if they only fished in our waters, they could return to their home port without coming into a Manx port, because by law they have to make landing declarations, and we have access to those declarations, and we also have access to bills of sale, so we can check the amount of
and you're happy that those are accurate?
There's always an element of possibility that there could be misreporting, but let's now look at how our measures work. Well, first of all, we do get intelligence, and we know what's going on in terms of...
This is other fishing boats telling you, is it?
I'd rather not disclose our sources, because but we do get intelligence, but we have more sophisticated monitoring equipment available to us nowadays. Our vessel monitoring system monitors vessels both in and out of our waters almost in real time, and we can tell by the behaviour of a vessel whether it's fishing or not.
And who does all this?
It's all done within our department with a very small team. And
so you don't have the sort of Atlantic gunboat coasting around amongst them all?
We have the Barul, which is actually sitting in Douglas Harbour as we sit here, which goes out and boards vessels. I think the system we've introduced is a win-win, really. It penalises...
So it has the power to board a vessel?
Yes.
And if it finds something wrong, what is the powers then?
We prosecute. Simple as that.
Can it seize the stock? Can it seize the boat? We
can seize the stock, generally, prosecute, and we can suspend licences. And to be fair, I mean, most people are law-abiding. but you get the ones that do break the law, and they're the ones that should be paying the price. And we're fairly non-partisan with our, well, not fairly, we are non-partisan. Sadly, one of our own fishermen was caught recently and fined £5,000 for fishing during the curfew hours. But I can tell you, having brought in these new measures, we have 7 or 8 boats that we have reasonable suspicion on, and this was before we brought in the new measures. They have been written to. We have 3 prosecutions outstanding for various other offences, and they will be proceeding fairly shortly. And we are very adamant that this is a good measure that will probably in the longer term be more effective than getting vessels to return to.
So what's the electronic daily catch return? What's that?
Well, that's a way of an electronic recording of, they have to email or electronically record the catch that they have, and that is reported to us, and we use that to determine whether they're catching scallops out of our waters or in our waters. So in other words, if a vessel comes in, it should.
But you still don't
electronically.
How do you verify that? And say they could send you any figure, couldn't they?
The barul is part of that process. Also, the amount of landings that they're making at other ports. A lot of vessels actually from Northern Ireland, for instance, land to Manx ports anyway. It's more the Scottish vessels that tend to go to Scotland because they have a processing industry there that requires scallops.
So you suspend the licence, the Manx licence, but the UK doesn't do so. They can still carry on fishing on a UK licence.
No, they can't. They cannot fish in our waters with just a UK licence. They have to have a licence to fish in our waters. So with the vessels that have historic rights to fish here, the 89, if we suspend a licence for up to 3 months pending investigation, they lose a large chunk of their income stream. And in the event of a successful prosecution, we may remove historic rights of access.
This is a prosecution in the Manx courts?
Absolutely.
So you've got to get them to turn up here as well?
Well, we have jurisdiction. If they don't turn up, then the licence remains suspended.
This has been a problem with fishing in the past in Manx courts, of course.
Yes, but there is always that perception, but they're not going to be able to come into our waters if they don't turn up for a court hearing. So that's quite an effective measure.
So, when you look at the report, for instance, in the Scottish Daily Record, the scallop fishermen, I quote, the scallop fishermen and processors in Kirkcudbright have been celebrating victory in their fight against the Isle of Man fishing legislation. And the Scottish fishermen said the move was discriminatory against them, and it goes on to talk about a load of other things. They may be Manx seas and Manx scallops, but we'll treat them as part of our traditional fishing ground, just as we've always done.
I read that too, and they would say that, wouldn't they? The reality is the new measures are quite draconian. If we find vessels breaking the rules, they will be caught. And they are fair in as much that it did discriminate to a certain extent, not a large extent, but to a certain extent, to boats that were not landing to Manx ports. But I think what we're doing now is a win-win for everyone, and it may well reduce the number of vessels fishing in our waters in due course if they break the rules.
What about closed and restricted areas? Is that still going on?
Very much so. We review that with Bangor University on a yearly basis and with the Scallop Board, and we have closed areas to allow repopulation. The Ramsey Bay Marine Reserve is a good example of working with local fishermen and how you can have a reserve that improves the marine environment, but at the same time we see increasing catches there, but that's managed locally, and it's a good example. In fact, it came up at the conference we had last week with environment ministers of how you can manage the marine environment to the advantage of both the environment and fisheries.
Does this mean there's going to be some zoning?
There will be more zoning. Marine reserves, we have 2 at the moment. We intend to have more in the very near future, but we are working with the producers and the fishermen, and we hope that we will be able to, in essence, transfer management of the 0 to 3 to the fisheries or the fishermen in due course, and they will cooperate with us. We will monitor and obviously enforce where necessary, but we want to see an area of cooperation.
So when the UK boats fish in Manx waters and take their catch home, we don't get anything out of that?
Sadly, we don't. And that is one of the big gripes I have, and I think we all have, in as much that is GDP lost from the Manx economy. But that's the way it is at the moment. If we renegotiate the FMA, hopefully we can capture more of that. I mean, in an ideal world, our fishermen will be fishing in our waters and all the catch would come
And if
to the Isle of Man.
Brexit comes about, and it looks as if it will, then a lot of these free trade arrangements will disappear with it. Does this mean then that perhaps you can bring up the barriers and make it a little more exclusive for our own fishermen?
We can renegotiate, let's put it like that. There will still be an element of control from DEFRA, and we have a very good relationship with them in terms of our trajectory. I think all the fisheries around Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales will all be looking for a greater measure of control over their fisheries.
Well, from my experience many years ago dealing with the UK government, there's a basic principle of what's mine's mine and what's yours is mine as well.
Well, there can be an element of that, but actually I think there's more realism nowadays. We're all in this together. The Irish Sea, we're not a big black hole in the Irish Sea. We're one of the key scallop fishing areas, and I think there is a reality that if we're going to have a sustainable fishery for everyone around the Irish Sea, then measures need to be brought in by all jurisdictions and proper management measures as that.
As long as it's all equal and fair and reciprocal, eh? So
well, that's the way it works, and that's what I'm here to ensure.
Okay, now let's move on to another hot topic that's been around for a long time now, and that's the meat plant. Now, it's been a troubled operation for a very long time now, and there's a new regime in place. So what is the structure of the new meat plant? What's different to what was there before?
Nearly in place. We are in the process of taking over. The transfer agreement hasn't been signed yet, but will hopefully be shortly. I think the meat plant's been a problem area for a long time. When red meat derogation was lost, in other words, we had the right to stop imports of red meat. When that went, the meat plant struggled, and it's struggled since then. Over the last few years, there's been more and more subvention required, and it reached a point last year where we were putting in nearly £1.3 million, and it was fairly obvious that there was little marketing going on, and we were losing animals through the meat plant to exports. Well, we either had to draw a line under it and allow the meat plant to close, and I didn't want that to happen. I think it's fairly general held view that it's a strategic asset to the island, especially for farming. Models elsewhere show that if you don't have an abattoir, then farming suffers, and in some respects it can almost be terminal to mainstream farming. So it's a strategic asset.
Well, this is farmers shooting themselves in their own feet then, isn't it? Because a great deal of animals now go to Cumbria.
Well, that has been a big problem, and you could say that, and the FMA who've been running it is a farmers' cooperative, which hasn't been that cooperative. But if I was a farmer and my year's output could be sold at a higher price, then I would be inclined to take it. So the fundamental problem was, why has the meat plant not been able to compete with those markets across? Now, there are some fundamentals in terms of scale of production and throughput on island.
An attitude to their customers, to the farmers too. We've had conversations at this programme with farmers who were very unhappy with what they considered the unequal treatment they were getting, particularly in the actual price offered for any particular animal.
Price has been the key word, but price is determined by what you can sell the product for at the end of the day.
They all come out the same in the end.
That's right, and I think one of the commitments we've made with this new regime, and it will take over in the near future. Prices have already moved up, but we're looking at equivalency, and I hate to use that word because it's one that's been bandied around by the farming community for many years, but that's what we're looking at with the UK market, so that the farmers will not be disadvantaged through the meat plant. And with better marketing, more efficiency, I think we will cut the losses with the meat plant, but the long-term future is to have a strategic partner. And this strange thing about lamb and beef is, if once the lamb is dead, the carcass is graded. Now, when those carcasses are sent across or wherever they go, when they're cut up, it's lamb. and it all sells for the same price, a small shoulder, a large shoulder. But if you don't market it properly from this end, or we have a strategic partner on the other side, then we lose value from our carcasses. And it's the same with beef. The prime cuts are fairly easy to sell, but the off cuts, if you sell them as just off cuts, they fetch very little money. If you mince it, for instance, mince suddenly becomes a valuable asset. And these are avenues that we've not been exploring or exploiting. And the new regime is certainly looking at everything to make sure we market properly. And that includes, we want to market ourselves, or the meat plant, as an asset that pays the right price, and we need to sell the product at the right price.
But this means that in the meanwhile, it's still going to have to be propped up.
I think there's a realisation, because of the scale of the operation, that there will be a need for ongoing subvention. We want to reduce that to the smallest amount possible. But yes, the realisation is that at the end of the day, if we want to retain that asset, we're probably going to have to keep subventing it to a certain degree for perpetuity.
But do you think the new plans will be sufficient to bring the Manx farmers back to home?
I think at the end of the day, our new pricing regime, when it's fully instigated, will bring meat into the plant. I mean, why would you want to export an animal if you can run it down the road into the local abattoir and get the same price? I think it's a no-brainer.
Well, I'm aware that the former president of the Manx Farmers Union, Tony Crane, said that the industry is just at the tipping point in being able to support the plant.
That's his view. I think at the end of the day, the plant needs a certain throughput to get an economy of scale. I think there are sufficient animals out there to make that work. Otherwise, we wouldn't be doing the work we're doing at the moment.
We hear ShopRite, for instance, complaining that they couldn't get enough Manx meat to sell. They were having to import it from Northern Ireland.
Well, they have a commercial strategy, and I'm sure that they play to that. I can't comment on the commercial aspect of their operation.
Well, yeah, but nevertheless, there is another one. I personally, a member of my family has an uncle actually who runs a large food wholesalers in France. On numerous occasions he's tried to get Manx meat, Manx kippers, Manx cheese, Manx everything, and struggled.
Well, I can't comment on that experience because I don't know. All I can say is our creamery is a successful cooperative and very successful. They export to America and all around the world. They've recently introduced a new
I think the cheese was the least of the problems, actually, because it was kippers, queenies and lamb.
Well, we all have to understand that production in the Isle of Man is limited, and there are only so many markets you can exploit. But certainly when it comes to the meat plant, I think we'll see a difference in the regime and marketing strategy. And we've recently had a procurement meeting with the producers, and the new policy going forward will ensure that we try and even out the supply coming in so that we can supply markets consistently rather than have glut and then boom, as we seem to have at the moment.
Yeah, so you think that the new structure and the new system might remove this hostility that they seem to have grown and exists between the farmers themselves, even though it's their cooperative, and those who operated it?
I certainly hope so, and all the signs are that the farmers do realise that if they're going to have a meat plant going into the future, they need to support it. But as I said earlier, if I'm a farmer and my year's production is going to market, I will try and get the best possible price. So it's down to the new organisation to ensure that the farmers are amply rewarded at the correct level or the market level for the future.
So what's the time allowed for the turnaround?
It's a difficult one. Things have gone somewhat more slowly than we had anticipated, but certainly we hope to sign the transfer agreement. Bear in mind, this is not a government-owned company. This is a separate entity set up where we have a golden share, but hopefully the transfer agreement will be signed within the next week or so.
Without government, it wouldn't exist.
Absolutely, and we acknowledge that the subvention will be ongoing, and we are supplying some of the expertise for the turnaround, and we anticipate that a long-term commitment in this respect. But it will be worth it, I'm sure.
Now, we've got a number of other issues now we can move on to, maybe not such a large nature as this, and we'll go around a few more of them after the commercial break. We'll be back in about 3 minutes.
There's your
In this week's Sunday Opinion, we're taking a look at the work of the Department of Environment, Food and Agriculture, and in particular the current issues of fishing controls, the meat plant, plastic pollution and the UNESCO biosphere. And our studio guest is the Minister for the Department, MHK for Glen, Faber and Peel, Geoffrey Boot. Well, we've talked about two of the main issues that have been surrounding the department for a particular period of time now, Geoffrey, but plastic pollution on our shores, on our land, in our rivers, wherever it may be. Well, that's not something new. We've been dealing with that for a very long time. I see the government is going to introduce targets to reduce the use of single-use plastics. Where's that? Is that within the government itself or in public in general?
Well, initially within government itself, but it's been one of those issues that's been around, as you say, for some time, and since I've been Minister, certainly I've had a number of questions, and it's revolved around plastic bags, use in supermarkets and various other aspects. The Chief Minister made a commitment a few weeks ago that we would refer this matter to our Environment and Infrastructure Committee and have a look at what we could do, particularly within government. We should be leading the way. But if you look at the Isle of Man in the whole, we do perform quite well, and with our biosphere status, we've done some work with UNESCO, and Bill Dale, with his beach buddies, have cleaned up our beaches considerably, and even this weekend they're out there picking up plastic, and I think some of our beaches, or most of our beaches, are as clean as anywhere in the world, or the cleanest beaches in the world. And by all accounts, this has helped not only the Isle of Man, but also our surrounding jurisdictions. There's less plastic being picked up on beaches around Morecambe Bay, for instance, in Northern Ireland, because the plastic, what comes around goes round, as it were. But we've recently had our Environment Ministers Conference here, and we were dialed into places like St Helena and the Falklands and the Falkland Island representative. I did ask whether plastic was a problem there, and they said yes, it is. It's increasingly causing problems in their seabird population, and the plastic they're finding has come from thousands of miles away. So it's a worldwide problem that needs addressing.
Well, yes, but government doing it internally, well, it's fine. But of course, a lot of the stuff that the beach buddies pick up, just as you've said, comes from far. Not just our local contribution, could be from the other side of Europe anyway.
That is sadly the problem. That's why I say it's a worldwide problem. We will do our bit. In fact, ShopRite have recently announced that they're going to stop single-use plastic bags. A number of retailers, the bigger retailers on the Isle of Man, already have levies, or they don't use bags in the same way that they used to. We're going to encourage that. It's always been difficult for us in terms of legislation, because it's a cumbersome process to bring in primary legislation. I would prefer these things to happen on a voluntary basis, but if we have to use a stick rather than a carrot, maybe we will have to do that in due course. But yes, sadly, a lot of what's going to affect the way we deal with plastics on the Isle of Man will happen elsewhere. But certainly at the conference we discussed how we should dispose or deal with single-use plastic and plastic in general. And I think it's accepted that we're never going to have an environment without plastic. I sit in this studio and I look at everything around.
But it's not single-use plastic.
No, some of it's recyclable, but we have an energy for waste plant on the island, and at the conference we were discussing using energy for waste plants with proper scrubbers and cleaning up the fumes and that come through as a final solution for single-use plastic, and it would be better to make more use of that.
Now, as far as the plastic, you talked about the Falkland Islands, but there was an article quite recently. It's turned up in the Antarctica and the Arctic. So yes, it travels around, and it travels a great deal. But so that's the plastic issue. What other issues, whilst you had your colleagues from the other colonies and crown dependencies, what other issues came top of their agenda?
Well, it was a very interesting conference. We covered a wide range of subject matter. Plastics obviously formed a part of that discussion. But we were talking about environmental issues that face us all in terms of sustainable environments. And also we looked at economies, and it's acknowledged that economic development goes hand in hand with better environmental measures, and sometimes that's lost in the environmental crusade. We, as a first world country, the Isle of Man, we are able to do things with the assets that we have available to keep our environment clean. We have our biosphere status, not because of what we're going to do, but because of what we've done in the past. We can improve on that. But if you look at our environment, generally, we have a patchwork of fields, and the farmers do a reasonable job in looking after that environment. If they weren't there, then we would have to manage the environment in another way. And we talked about the issues that revolve around agriculture, some of the risk factors in terms of the environment. But on the whole, it's a good story on the Isle of Man.
Yes, well, some of these countries you were talking about, of course, can be subject to things like natural disasters of volcanoes or hurricanes. Or we apart from bad weather, we don't have particularly too much of that. But then you get Gibraltar, which is a colony. It's part of effectively known like us as a crown dependency. And we don't have a great deal of land to grow things on. They must import most of their stuff. I mean, where does that leave them in all of this?
Well, one of the subjects for discussion was Brexit, and Gibraltar.
Particularly relevant for them.
Yes, and obviously that affects other countries as well. Now, it's surprising to learn that the overseas territories actually get a lot of their environmental funding via the EU, and they have, to a certain extent, felt neglected by the UK over the many years since their EU membership. But we had 3 representatives from the UK, including the Foreign Office, DEFRA, and their climate change deputy negotiator, as well as interaction with Minister Coffey, who's the Undersecretary that deals with matters. And we discussed the funding issues around Brexit, but also in particular how Brexit will affect us, because we don't get funding from the UK or the EU, but we rely on access to markets for our agricultural products and fisheries particularly. And it was surprising when we were talking to the Falklands that 60 to 70% of the fish caught in Falkland waters are sold into the Spanish market. So they also have a requirement for market access. And there are concerns around that, and these were expressed in some detail. Different considerations for different jurisdictions, but similar problems.
But the UK at the moment is focusing on its own issues with this. I mean, I know we keep hearing this, but really, do you think that we are being taken into consideration, or we're just being sort of patted on the head?
Well, I hope we are. My department spends a lot of time talking to DEFRA representatives. The Chief Minister's done a lot of work, and in fact I've accompanied him on occasions in dealing with Westminster MPs and shakers and movers to ensure that the Isle of Man is not forgotten. And I always use that term. We are not a black hole in the middle of the Irish Sea. We are part of the British Isles, and environmentally we're an important part of the British Isles, as well as a small trading nation that requires access. Now, we try and get that message across in as many different ways as we can, and sometimes we're criticised for going off island and spending money, but if you don't spend this money and make these contacts, then yes, there is a possibility that we are forgotten in the bigger picture. And I know that the conference that we've just hosted was a very useful interaction among many leaders and shakers and movers from around the world, and that will eventually pay dividends, I'm sure.
Well, one can only but hope. Now, just moving away, we were talking about various things, pollution in different forms, plastic in particular, but then we come back to something else which is almost the complete converse of that, and that's the Isle of Man's biosphere status.
Well,
now, can you tell us a bit more about that?
Well, it's a UNESCO designation, and we are the only nation, entire country to have this status, which is, it's unique at the moment. And it's not just about the environment, it's about everything on the Isle of Man. The way we live, the way we manage ourselves, and it's a great accolade. And in fact, I think the Chief Minister has said that it's one of the greatest things he's ever been involved in, receiving that status. I think it was last year when it went through. We haven't yet really exploited it, and I use the word exploiting advisedly, because we need to make the most of that status. It does cost us in terms of our environmental stewardship and the things that we do on the island. We need to move that on, but it's a great accolade when it comes to tourism, promotion of tourism, eco-tourism. it's also a branding exercise for our produce that we send abroad. Our fisheries and our agricultural produce can go with a provenance label that comes from a UNESCO biosphere.
Well, it's early days yet, but have you seen any signs of something happening? Any first inkling?
It's difficult to tell at the moment. We've now appointed a biosphere champion. That's taken a while to get someone in post, but from a department perspective, we're going to be making a big push over the next 6 to 9 months. Get publicity, get the message out there, get people, producers, manufacturers on the island to buy into the provenance of the biosphere.
Well, how are you going to do that, though? Because this has always been the case, that there's been a desire in the island to promote one thing or another. And it seems to sort of fall on deaf ears once it goes a distance from our shores.
Well, no. Well, yes, there is an element of that, because we are small, but we bat above our station. But certainly from the department's perspective, we now have a provenance label, which is properly policed. We have a butcher's provenance label, for instance, that gives provenance to our meat produce, and I think that combined with our biosphere status will help us market further afield in future. But it will also help our local market as well, because there's brand loyalty, and Manx people like to buy Manx produce.
We do, but of course we've had this conversation on programmes before where people say, I want to buy Manx but I can't afford it.
Well, that is a fair comment, and there will always be a two-market strategy. You only have to go into a supermarket and have a look at their own brands, own name produce, lower cost. But then there are people who want a premium product, and we are positioning ourselves to produce artisanal food at premium quality. I think Michael Gove recently positioned the UK in that respect. We don't necessarily want to be competing in the lower commodity markets. No. Our produce is premium.
Yet with the amount of land here, amount of people involved in agriculture and horticulture and other forms of growing things, we should be able to grow all our own stuff, with the exception of citrus fruits and that sort of thing, shouldn't we? I mean, this place should be almost self-sustaining.
Well, once upon a time, the Isle of Man was self-sustaining, all about. But we're in the modern world now. People want produce out of season. Our food matters.
I was talking about the basic commodities.
Well, we can. Our food matters strategy is positioning us, and our GDP in farming and agriculture has grown substantially over the last few years.
Right, well, now we must end this week's Sunday Opinion, in which the Minister for the Department of the Environment, Food and MHK, Geoffrey Boot, discussed the work of his department, just some of the work of his department, and the current issues being tackled. Now,